All right, I'm showing in 10 a.m. Pacific Coast time, so let's get the show rolling here. Good morning and or good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's KAMIND webinar, CMMC Level 2 Enclave Design. My name's Mike Klass, and I'm an account manager here at KAMIND IT. Before we get rolling today, a couple of housekeeping items. There will be time for Q&A at the end, so if you could keep your microphone on mute during the presentation, that would be excellent. With many of us still working from home, we'd like to eliminate all background distraction noises. If you have any questions mid-presentation, please feel free to use the chat functionality or the raise hand icon, and we'll be sure to weave your questions into the webinar best we can. We will be recording today's webinar, so if you're uncomfortable with this, now would be your opportunity to opt out. Now with that out of the way, let's get down to business. So some questions you might have that hopefully will get answered on today's webinar. What is a CMMC Level 2 enclave? Are there differences between a CMMC Level 1 and a CMMC Level 2 enclave? And what's the most efficient way to either build or purchase a enclave? So again, hopefully we'll answer some of those questions for you. So please sit back and relax, and let's hear our president and CEO, Matt Katzer, talk to us today about CMMC Level 2 Enclave Design. Please take it away, Matt.
Hey, Mike, thanks, and welcome everyone. Hey, over the years, it's been very interesting as we've gone through and seen the changes to CMMC and the different ways to approach it. But it really, we come up in terms of enclave ends up being the discussion that a lot of people have. And so what I thought, I was talking to their sales team and talking to our clients and really trying to figure out there's really a lack of understanding. Why would you do it? And what's the cost advantages of doing something like an enclave? And what it really comes down to, and when you look at CMMC Level 2, and we're going through the same process ourselves as we go through our certification process for CMMC Level 2, you have to figure out how you're going to reduce the scope, because reducing the scope is going to also mean in terms of how do you actually reduce your cost and how do you actually reduce things known as your security protected assets. And so this all builds into this whole thing. What is a CMMC Level 2 enclave and what type of design do you really look at? So I thought I would take and spend some time this morning and just kind of walk through this and see if we can answer your questions. And for those that are new for KAMIND IT with its fourth year running as an Inc. 5000, fastest growing company in the US. And we're also known as one of the 235 managed Microsoft partners in the United States. There's roughly 30,000 partners. And we're also a direct reseller, including GCC high licenses. And we're one of the 52 companies that are allowed to actually purchase and provide and provision GCC high licenses in Azure EA. We also are really targeted to a lot of things in terms of CMC and Office 365. And personally, I published 3 Office 365 books with over 280,000 copies sold, all about security and how do you actually drive down IT cost. But let's get back to what we're looking at, really what we're trying to do. And that's really trying to figure out this whole nut of how do you actually reduce cost with CMMC Level 2. And it's easy as 1, 2, 3, but we've got to know the why. And I think that many times when we look at what's going on, we see federal regulations coming down, and we're seeing a lot of pressure in terms of the commercial side, in terms of the insurance and cyber liability insurance, and what's the requirements and everything else. But let's go take a little back in history, go back and look at CMMC. And I got my favorite slide that I've seen in the presentation before. And this is kind of interesting. The reason why I like to do it is that it really kind of defines why you have security is so much change in the environment. Before, when we talk about security, it was this little add-on that we tagged on to our current offering. It doesn't matter if an IT shop, you're a vendor, what type, you just kind of stuck it. You never really thought about building it in. And what's happened, especially with all the ransomware attacks and all the nation state attacks, we have the what's going on in Ukraine, what's going on in terms of Russia, and how all these things are affecting us in China as well. So it's really changing, and really what's happening, and DoD's was looking back, and when they put in place in terms of the NIST 800-171, the CMC specification, they really wanted to have cybersecurity as this core building block. So, and if you're looking at today, it's like, for examples, if you have older laptops, the new laptops that you have are usually using the TPM 2.0 chipset. So you have it down in hardware in terms of serial numbers and processors, how all those things are basically used for encryption and uniqueness. And that's what the fundamental change of cybersecurity. So it's a complete solution you look at. And that's why I like this slide. It probably puts in perspective. This is what's really going on. And when you look at your businesses, and we're all business owners and we're all basically our stewards for other clients, our clients' data, we all have a requirement to really protect the information. And it's fundamental in terms of how our business is structured. Now let's go back in terms of look at some of the real rules in play and what's really happened in terms of different types of things. So, they start off in terms of the DFARs with the 2019 D41 in terms of what the amendment in terms of implementation of the assessment methodology for cybersecurity. This defined the original CMMC 1.0. What slipped under the radar for most of us is this Dfar clause that came out that's in almost everybody's contract now, the 252.204-7012. Why this is important is that basically this is the monitoring requirements that you need to put in place to basically manage in terms of CUI in your environment. Now, if you remember the original CMMC 1.0, they had a lot of monitoring built into the CMC 1.0, and that went away 2.0. And people say, oh, we don't have to do that. That's not the case because it's always there, part of the DFARS 252, 290, 204, 7012 clause. And that's really requires that you have to basically manage and monitor the CUI and access. So if you're not putting monitoring and security programs in place, you need to be doing that because that's in your contract right now. And that's really important to basically look at it. And then you have some other types of change that happen in terms of, making sure you do your supplier risk score, your SPURS score, your number. And you have to basically evaluate against the NIST 800-171. And that's just also another requirement. So if you're a contractor, or if you're a defense contractor, or you're supporting an industry with defense contractors, you need to file a SPURS score. That's just the way. That's the law, and that's the structure. And more of this is coming through in terms of what you actually need to actually do. Now, in terms of some of the other changes that you've seen in terms of what the contractor compliance and cybersecurity, we have a lot of pieces that are getting in place of what you have to do. So as you look through in terms of the timeline and everything else, there is requirements that you need that you'll have to implement. Like right now, we're approaching the new contract year on October 1st. You're going to start seeing more and more CMMC requirements being put in place. There is going to be an interim ruling coming out in March this year about what is a CMC and the score numbers and what you need to do. And you're going to actually see more and more pressure to put on all of us to make sure that we're compliant. And part of the thing that we have to internalize is that the DoD has not changed the timeline. The timeline still is the timeline. Now you see where we are here. We're at this, I kind of put a flag right here as you go in 2023. They're still marching to this 2025 date where you're going to have all the requirements of CMC going to be rolling into all your contracts. So if you haven't started, you need to start the process. You need to figure out what it is. And this led into the whole concept of what we call about enclaves, which I'll get in a few moments. And just kind of give you some other housekeeping items that you have in terms of where we are today. If you look at CMC 2.0, if you look in terms of where the level 1, level 2, this is really the NIST 800-171. Level 1 is really only having, a small subset of controls, 16 controls that you actually have to implement. And then level 2 have the additional controls that you need to implement. The whole stack is in NIST 100, 171, the 110 controls. If we do level 3, that is actually, you have to complete certification for level 1 before you, certification for level 2 under the NIST 800-171 before you can actually get to 172. Now, what happened this previous year, one of the other changes is this whole concept of self-assessment. Now, what DoD did, and this was a town hall that they actually had in February, they basically came out and said that this whole concept of doing, self-assessment for level 2 is not going to exist. You're going to have to go through a certification process for a C3PO. Now, in terms of an annual assessment that you go through for level 1, that will exist, but it's going to be an annual. You're going to have to do these every year, so you're going to have to figure out how to build this into your process. Now, there's a lot of kind of noise on this. Is this true? Is it not true? What's going on with DoD? But this is all going to come out in March this year when they do the interim ruling, and that's going to cast in concrete what we need to do. But I just want to give you a heads up now that if you're thinking that you can self-assess for level 2, you're going to have to go through a third-party C3PO. Now, one of the other things that changed is that DIBCAC, in terms of their evaluation, is they're basically going to be focusing on more of the level 3 folks, and the community is going to be focusing on the, in terms of level 2. Now, they also passed some interim ruling in terms of basically be able to tag along with, they may have a DIBCAC representative tag along through those third-party assessments. And that's basically like if DIBCAC was part of it. So there's a lot of changes happening and everything else. And the best thing you need to do is really internalize what your schedule are, figure out how you're going to get there, and basically put the process in place. So when you take a look at CMC level 1, level 2, and some of these seen our presentations before, you'll notice that we have this theme that we basically, this process flow. And basically what we have in level 1, it's really about building out the foundation. Now, all of you that are going for level 2, you got to do your level 1. So it's level 1 is you have 6 domains and 17 controls in level 1. And then in level 2 have the additional 11 domains and 93 controls. The combination of level 1 and level 2 is the NIST 800-171, the 110 controls. So you're going to have to go through the whole process. Now, when we actually looked in trying to figure out how the best way we can help the community and help our clients is we actually introduced the concept of a DIY kit, for instance, and that's gives you this whole idea of basically how do you actually build this model so you actually put stuff in place so you basically get the foundational pieces in place for CMC level 1. And this is crucial in terms of what you're doing because as an organization, CMC level 1 is a self-attestment of as an organization. Take KAMIND for existence. We do commercial customers, we do Department of Defense customers. So what we do is our environment, we basically structured so that we're completely level 1 compliant and we self-attest at level 1. And then we actually built a separate CMC enclave for level 2. Which is what we're talking about doing here. This is the model that we're actually using so we can control the costs and also control the tool sets that we actually use. And this is a whole concept that you're based on it. So when we came out with when we looked at doing a DIY kit, we actually looked at what we're doing for our level 1. And we're a Microsoft partner, so we basically, everything we implemented is on the Microsoft 365 E5. So we built the level 1 DIY kit around that. So you have the IT policies, you have the IT plans. So if you're running commercial 365 and you want to go implement CMMC level 1, we basically give you the tools necessary, and if we actually help you manage your 365 in commercial environment, we actually help migrate make sure you got the right subscription mixes and everything else. And what Microsoft did is KAMIND is also part of the Microsoft CMMC Acceleration Committee, and as part of it, they published something known as the placemat. And so what the placemat does, it basically defines what you need to do for the controls. And so we actually tailored the DIY kit to basically do these things. So you build this necessary pieces. Now, do you have to use KAMIND's DIY kit? No, you can go do your own implementation. But what you want to do is you want to follow the CMC level 1 placemat. You need to follow the placemat and use it. Now, one of the other things that that KAMIND has approached and what we did in the placemat, we looked at tons of the governance risk compliance tools in the market. I mean, you got Comply Up, you have, you got rapid fire tools, you got Compliance Forge, you got a bunch of third parties that you actually have in different tools. And we settled on using one of the tools for Future Feed, which we include in the DIY kit. This is a level 1, where basically you see what the level 1 score would be. Now, what's going to happen and what we understand, I shouldn't say what's going to happen, we really don't know, but as we kind of understand and what the tea leaves tells us, when DoD is going to announce in terms of the interim ruling in March, they're supposed to come out with saying, okay, what are instead of filing NIST 800 171 scores, you're going to file CMC L1 scores or CMC L2 scores, which is basically you're doing NIST 800 171, you're just using a different metric against it. So this is like in our DIY kit, for instance, is that if you're doing a CMC level 1, this is the type of information that you have. Now, if you're actually deploying CMC level 2, like in our case for KAMIND, we build a CMC L2 enclave. And so we now have to go into the enclave and make sure the enclave, this is a separate, and it's like a separate room in a house, and that meets all the controls. So the best way to analyze and look at this is that we have our house is a level 1 house. So we make sure MFA, all the level 1 controls are placed. And we have a special room inside that house, which is basically a level 2 room. Now, since we're all cloud cloud entity, our level 1 environment is Office 365 Commercial, and our level 2 environment happens to be GCC High or Azure Government. And likewise, when you do our level 2 environment, you basically you have the necessary scores that you have. And this is all fundamental when you actually look at it. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to put a strategy in place, your business. How do you actually get to level 2? How do you do it in such a way where you don't break everything? And this is really kind of a serious question, because one of the things that you're looking at, especially with all the third-party tools, you now have the question saying, what about my email filtering I'm using? I'm using company ABC. Is their email filtering actually compliant? What happens if CUI is actually sent through email in that compliant mail filter? Is it stored in an encrypted database that's a FedRAMP compliant? I mean, all these issues, if you're a developer, what type of development tools do you use? Are you using contractors? Do you use third-party contractors? Are they US citizens? Are they not US citizens? All these questions come up, and you have to start looking at it from a business standpoint of how you want to actually manage the organization and reduce the security footprint, what I call the security surface area that you potentially have CUI breaches on. And you also want to basically make sure you manage the environment. And that's basically what happens. You start with an enclave design. And an enclave design is like that house I'm talking about. It's like you have that separate room in the cloud that's uniquely designed to handle all the requirements for CMC level 2. Now, as your business, you're going to have your business do a bunch of different things. And you have to kind of really ask the questions, like when you actually go through an assessment. If you really want to reduce your costs of your assessment, you got to reduce the number of assets that you're going to have to actually look at. And you're going to have to basically figure out what the scope is. Does everyone in the organization need access to CUI? What happens for the cleaners that happen to come in? What happens for the HVAC vendors that come in? Should they have access into the CUI area where you store CUI? How do you actually manage it? What about the systems you have in your environment? Do you have your systems locked down? Like one of the things that we did at KAMIND, we went to 100% mobile environment. So basically everyone has a laptop, everything's totally encrypted. We don't have any desktop environments. We don't have any server environments. There's nothing somebody can plug into. There's nothing somebody can steal, because that's a type of thing, that's a type of questions and you have to look at. And you have this other type of concept is SPA chaining. What SPA is a security protected asset. So when you talk about like KAMIND, for instance, we have a CMMC level 2 enclave. a separate area in cloud and Azure government, which we actually use to manage other Department of Defense contractors. So in that environment, it's basically we're controlled what we have access, what users can get access to. And that's kind of really important. And then the other question you start asking about, what about your COTS software? You know, the commercial off-the-shelf software. You know, the DoD loves acronyms, and so COTS is a great one. But, you know, what about the tools? You know, what tools are you using? Is the data stored? You know, do you have a certain set of tools that have data basically stored in AWS commercial or 365 commercial or in a private data center? You know, how do you actually manage it? What happens those tools touch CUI? You know, and like I said earlier, do you have full control of the maintenance folks? What happens in your environment? You know, if you're in a public office, small business, you're in probably a landlord space, you probably don't have control over who's going to do maintenance, who's going to do the third-party maintenance in your office, or who's going to do the cleaning. How do you actually manage all those things? Do you want to take your whole environment and basically make it level 2 compliant, or are you basically saying, okay, where's the need to know? And this whole idea, do you have control over the physical security? And, you know, and how do you actually handle, you know, become compliant and do a strategy where you can be compliant and migrate over time? So as an example goes, is some companies that we're coming across will say that I want to do the entire organization CMC level 2, and then suddenly they go through and say, geez, you know, I got 300 people, I look at this, I'm doing building, suddenly I have an assessment cost of $600,000, $700 million. How do I actually go reduce that? Well, you start basically saying, okay, I want to reduce the scope of it, and then I'll add users to that environment as I clean up some of those things I need to do. And that brings in the whole concept of as an enclave. And when you start looking at an enclave, you have to look at your organization and say, where's CUI? You got to locate where the CUI is. Is that in the organization that you currently have? And basically get it right down and kind of figure out the pieces for it. Now with the Microsoft, you know, we're Microsoft partners, so of course we're going to have Microsoft data centers. Microsoft has 2 data centers. You look at it, there's the commercial data center, which is worldwide global access. So many of you, if you actually have a 365 commercial, you'll have people from China, you'll have people from Australia, across the world, English speaking, addressing problem tickets and issues. However, on the Azure government, this is all continental US. And basically it means that you have US citizens in it, it's a controlled environment, and basically it meets all the requirements. So it has the fundamental, it has that CMC or that NIST 800-171 level of compliance. Now you have to add the necessary policy and procedures and controls on top of it. So when you look in terms like one of the questions we constantly ask that people say, do I need GCC high? Do I not? Well, there's a couple of questions you really ask yourself. One, do you do ITAR? And if you do ITAR, you're in GCC high. End of discussion. If you have CUI or name CUI, you're in GCC high. I mean, that's the nature of it when you look at 365. Now, when you do the cloud separation, now keep in mind the data centers are physically different. They're not located with each other. They're different parts of a city, for instance. They may be different parts of the country. There's the Azure Gov data centers and there's a commercial data center. So they're different. There's no interaction between them. And that's where you get into this whole cloud separation concept. So that basically you're looking in terms of where the cloud is, where your security protected assets and how you actually manage it. They're 2 different environments. And they got to keep in mind the rules. And the whole, you know, when you look at in terms of what enclave design means is that you basically are scoping 2 different areas. You're scoping the area for the entire company for level 1. Keep in mind, level 2, you got to have the same process controls. And then you're going to have a separate area that you're going to scope for level 2, which is your enclave. And the whole goal is to reduce this footprint and the covered assets you're going to manage and make it a much more simpler environment. So when you look in terms from an assessment view, you want to make sure that the organization, that your level 1 organization is outside the scope and you're really only going to have the assessment on the level 2. So as you look in terms of what this actually manage in terms back to a diagram we have earlier, you're basically trying to get this model where this is a level 1 scoped environment. I'm still going to put the same type of controls and necessary to actually manage it. But from an assessment standpoint, is I'm going to basically control what I'm going to control my assessment costs. And that's really the strategy about an enclave. And the other questions we had asked about, well, I build those things, how do I collaborate? Well, there's been a lot of changes with Teams, for instance, in terms of collaboration. There's a much more rich collaboration now where you can actually integrate the basically features. So one of the things in the past is that people were basically opening up 365 and having GCC talk to 365. And that's not the way you want to do it. You want to basically invite users into trusted users into the environment. So basically you control all the necessary security policies, all the necessary things you need to do and manage it. And from a pictorial, what this really looks like when you do a B2B collaboration, and this is like even saw ourselves in our own company at KAMIND, we build the same model so we still have this collaboration. So when we actually talk a GCC high, I like this diagram probably the best, is it gets you this idea where basically you have in continental US, you have your GCC high tenant, you have a Teams, you basically invite commercial users into it. They're required to authenticate everything. But what's a key thing about this is you control information going in and out, you control the data, and basically you meet all the necessary rules and requirements and you manage it. And that's a secret of the whole thing. You have to actually manage the security processes. So how do you actually get to the level 1? Well, we talked a lot of this is that, you get to a level 2 enclave, look at the organization, go look at basically, like you see, like I said before, go build out the level 1 for the entire organization. And if you haven't, and if you need help in terms of the process, leverage in terms of our DIY kit, and there's also third parties as well. So you basically go build this process model. And then when you actually build that place, you put the necessary hooks in place. And then, of course, what you end up doing, you want to move to level 2. And level 2, you're going to be in a different data center. You're going to go into GCC high. You're going to have your level 1 is going to be into 365. And basically, and then you have a different set of controls on it. And that's what it looks like. And that's how you actually are doing the design. So when all is said and done at the end of the day, when you actually go through the assessment process, you're going to scope where you're going to know where CUI is. You're going to basically design the environment. You're going to build the enclave so you fit into this model where you actually control the information. And then you're going to do what we call a discovery of the gap, do a gap assessment. What controls are missing? Because by the time you want to go through this whole process and build your POAM, your plans and milestones, then in terms of how you need to fix things, you want to end up in this environment that looks like this on this upper right-hand side because you want to reduce the scope, and reducing the scope controls cost. And that's a secret. And that is really this nutshell of the secret. The whole enclave strategy is it's just a part of the foundation. Build the foundation, expand the foundation in a controlled area, and do a select. You don't need to select all the users. You can do a small segment of users. Get that environment certified. Get that environment put the level 2, and put the right processes in place so that over time, if it makes business sense, you can actually move more of these commercial folks into the level 2 environment. So you're basically doing a control. You can keep costs under control. It's a plan implementation, and you basically structure it so you're saving the company money. And yeah, you're going to have to spend some third-party costs, but basically it's controlled cost. And as a CEO of a company, you can plan for things if you understand the costs and you can budget for them, but you don't want to basically have, surprises in terms of expenditure and everything else. And in terms of information, just from a standpoint of what you have to have is that you go to the acquisition site that has the latest information associated with it. Now, what I actually did on this in terms of the enclave, we talked about theoretically how the design really works, But what I did is I wanted to take some cost numbers around it and show you what typically costs are going to see. And this is, the costs are very fluid in the market right now. But the goal is basically trying to budget so you can actually achieve the necessary things you need to do, because you don't want to be in a position that you have to go at the last minute, struggle to get a CMC L2 certification, because if you're doing it at the last moment, you're going to fail. And it's going to cost you, you're going to spend tons and tons of hundreds of thousands of dollars for it. So the goal in terms of what you need to do, you got to get a hold of the technical reference guide for the CMC deployment. That's really the key. And then from a process model, you need to follow the process model that we have here, is build out this environment for level 1 for the entire company, and then figure out what the enclave strategy based on where you're going to scope, scope CUI, and then figure out the pieces for it. And that's kind of the whole strategy involved in as you go through the migration process. And when you look at the pieces that you want to try to do this is, this is really kind of laying the foundation. And, it's a lot of you have gone through and said, okay, I have cyber insurance liability policies, I'm doing this. I mean, if you're going through and look at, like, many of you have submitted your cyber insurance applications for renewal, and you go through that checkbox and say, yes, everyone's done MFA. Well, guess what? You're doing CMC L1 because everybody needs to do MFA, multi-factor authentication. Those are the things you have to do. So you get to the point that you build that foundation, start with the fundamental kit on it, in terms of the various pieces you need to do, and build that and get the policy and procedures in place. Using from us, there's third parties, a lot of different ways you can go about getting this, but you build that for the organization. Then once you actually scope, the next step you go through and you scope where CUI is, then you basically figure out, okay, what users do I need to really have in terms of GCC high? And that's a separate piece. And now you start looking at how you build on it. But keep in mind, the initial 17 controls I did for the level 1, those are immediately, I can use those same information, same documents to cut my costs down in terms of what we want to do for level 2. And then a level 2 process comes down to really this whole interim model, where you basically going to deploy 365, you're going to scope the environment, where's CUI, figure out where the gap is in terms of what's your implementation is it, do a POAM for the changes, go through this interim process back and forth, and then you're going to go through a pre-assessment and certification, and then you're going to put a management process, a security management process, to basically monitor and make sure you're compliant. And you're required to do this under Dfar 7012. So with that and everything else, what does it really cost for this? So what I did is I looked through, some of our clients and everything else, and some of the discussions that we have with folks, and I came up with this hypothetical company. They're roughly 20 users, is that they need to have access into CUI, and the company size is 100 folks, and they have 20 users and access to CUI. So what is the process, or what is the cost associated with it? Well, as you look through this whole thing, and you go through the step 1, the company implements an L1 attestation. And really we offer a kit that gives you a policy and procedures on it. But really when it comes down to, if you have cyber liability, if you file for a cyber liability insurance, you have any type of governance requirements, you're doing any type, you're implementing CMC L1. You just haven't really figured it out yet or haven't been told. But basically what you want to do is you want to go look at the CMC level 1 and say, okay, do I have MFA on everything? Do I really make sure I'm auditing the logs? I mean, that's really what it is. And you should be doing this regardless if you're in the defense contractor. This is fundamental to your business. And it's like when we just went through in our case, going through our assessment for our cyber liability insurance. We carry a multi-million-dollar cyber liability policy. So what we implemented, ours was actually fairly straightforward, because guess what? We implemented all the CMC L1. We implemented all the necessary things that the insurance companies were asking. Now, next year, we're going to find, for our case, we're going to have to go to SOC 2 because we're seeing that in the tail end of 23, 24, in order to get liability insurance, you're going to have to be SOC 2 compliant. Well, guess what? If you're actually following the CMC level 1, the SOC 2 portion becomes much more of, it's more of the administration things, not so much the technical things that you need to do. So as an organization, we already have met this without that much work. You're doing this now. And if you're not doing a level 1 now and you're using an MSP that has basically doing some things, you need to talk to your MSP or go talk to us. We can give you some reference of other folks to go talk with, but you should be doing this as a step 1 right now. This is a matter of survival, and it's a matter of stewardship of your information, but also your employees' information and how you actually manage client. Then I said, okay, now in this hypothetical company size of 100 users, I'm only going to have technically, I really want to have all 100 users be GCC high, but to actually do that, that's going to be too cost effective. What do I really need to do? Well, in this case, we only really have about 20 users we need to put in place. And then I can add more users over time and everything else. But when I actually look at the strategies, I said, I start building out my enclave. And I said that, okay, I'm going to build out the Azure Gov. It's going to cost me roughly $20,000. I'm going to actually go build the policy and procedures. And typically those run about $25K on top of what you're spending. That will give you the environment that you need. Then I'm going to go through a pretest, and the pretests that we're seeing, that the ones that we're paying for, they cost roughly about $25,000, and our certification is going to cost $25,000. So we're going to spend $95,000 to get our enclave built to get level 2 compliant. I mean, that's kind of cost. Now, that's a one-time cost. Now, the annual cost of this is going to come down to the pieces. Well, I'm going to have a license cost. Well, I have a license cost on 365 commercial. I have a license cost on GCC high. Well, so there's the difference. So I'm going to pay that license cost. It's a little bit higher in GCC high. I'm going to use a GRC tool. That's a government risk compliance tool. That tool that I have in terms of future feed, why we use that is that what we have to do today, based on our requirements for our insurance companies now, for the clients we service, we have to prove that, yes, we did update the firewalls. Yes, we did basically validate everybody had MFA. Yes, we did. We have to actually do all that stuff. So right now, today, without CMMC, set that aside, we actually have to basically do a governance risk compliance tool, validate that we basically are implementing MFA, validate that we're basically doing the audit logs, because the insurance companies are looking, if there's a claim, they're looking for a way to reject the claim. So when you look at CMMC, for us, it's just an easy walkthrough because we're doing all those processes anyway. And then the other aspect that you have, and so that's where we use a GRC tool. And depending on where the tool comes from, you can do your own, build your own, buy your own. If you're a big company, you probably have built your own. We use Future Feed. Future Feed for level 2 is roughly about $7K a year. So it's about, it just depends which type of process you want to go through. And then it's basically, and then the other piece, because of the Dfar 7012 clause, you're going to have to do some type of security management. Now, you can do that internally if you wanted to with your SecOps staff, or you can farm it out to someone like KAMIND that handle this as well. So you're going to have this annual maintenance cost that you have for users. And that gives you an idea of what you're looking at. Now, you're going to have, if you're a smaller company, say, hey, I'm only going to have 5 users, that you'll be able to kind of work down these areas in red. I highlighted those areas in red because you'll be able to get kind of different price numbers, valuation, what the cost will. But these other numbers that you have, this is kind of what it costs to build these things out. Now, you can do all this yourself. That's why I referenced the technical reference manual if you want to go follow that. But it comes down to what's the best way to actually approach it. But I wanted to give you an idea what the cost structure in a 100-user company, 20 users are going to build an enclave. Now, what's nice about this whole model is that as you go through and let's say a year from now and say, well, I'm going to add 5 more users. Well, you don't have to go through the step 2. You're just adding the additional users because you put all the policy and procedures and processes in place and you're managing it. So the incremental cost is not that much. So as you go clean up your COTS tool, as you go clean up the third-party tools you use, you can actually keep costs under control. And that's what I really wanted to have and basically give an idea of what the cost structure would be for that. Now, we have some other interesting things. That's in terms of the piece on it. We have some other stuff coming up that want to make you guys aware of. You know, we have an upcoming webinar that in cyber insurance, for instance, that's going to be on November 10th. Also, we have another webinar. I didn't put it on here, is Viva. In Viva, we have a Viva webinar on October 13th. And that's basically going to give you about Viva goals and how to do different types of, you know, how to manage your employment business and everything else. So with that, what I like to try to do is turn it back over to Mike, and I hope this gave you the information that you have to give you an idea what the costs and give you a plan. But you got to start now so you can keep these pieces, the cost under control. With Mike, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you, Matt. Great job. And actually, this is where we really encourage questions from the audience. And I'd like to start by asking the first question today. So if I understood you correctly, Matt, for a commercial account, you know, that only needs level 1, your FCI, their data is in the commercial cloud. And then with the level 2 customer, who, you know, a customer who needs level 2 CMMC certification, they're in the government GCC cloud with their CUI data of their accounts. So if I'm like a project manager for a company that has both commercial and government DoD accounts, and I need to, you know, 1 minute be accessing commercial data, and then, you know, an hour later be accessing GCC data for different clients we deal with, does that mean I need like 2 laptops, or how do I access, you know, if I'm in the commercial side, how do I access the GCC side without being in violation of the CMMC rules?
Hey, Mike, that's a really good question. And this gets into this is in the conclave. So once you have that infrastructure built, so you have an enclave, the question is, how do you manage it? Do you actually have a dedicated laptop for it? Or do you basically put the necessary protections in place on your commercial laptop and basically have a AVD and Azure Virtual Desktop or a Windows or Cloud 365 Cloud PC in Azure that runs unique in the environment? It has all the controls wrapped around it, so you can make sure bad stuff doesn't go in, everything's under a controlled fashion. And you're using basically a collaboration from teams to basically put information into the cloud. So in a very controlled fashion, that's how you actually handle it. So when we actually are doing like on the DIBCAP assessments that they're going through, they're basically not ignoring that asset, but they're basically what their DIBCAC is doing when you have an environment which is a virtual environment, basically a virtual PC. They want the controls to put in place on that asset. Now you can put all the controls in place on the commercial side too. It's just that you don't want to have CUI. It's not going to be stored there. It's only in Azure Gov. And that's how you solve it. So you basically, it's really 2 things. Either go do an Azure Virtual Desktop in Azure Gov, you do a Cloud PC in Azure Gov, and build out a Teams collaboration site. Remember that Teams collaboration site I showed early, and that's how you basically manage it and push information into GCC High and be compliant.
Great. Thanks, Matt. I was wondering about that, so I appreciate that answer. Again, we'd like to open it up. You can, you know, just unmute yourself, ask away. If you want to be on camera, please, you know, put yourself on camera. If you're shy and you just want to ask questions via the chat window, feel free. But we want this to be, you know, a 2-way conversation. So if you have any questions that are lingering in the back of your mind, now is your opportunity to ask away, and we'd love to hear your questions and hopefully give you good answers.
The one question that I'm asked a lot of times is that the price difference between the GCC high and the commercial licenses. The best way to look at that is they run roughly about 40% higher. That's why, you know, for our sake, even though it makes more sense for Microsoft to say, hey, put everybody in GCC high, you want to basically leverage what makes business sense. A Microsoft 365 E5 is $57 in commercial, and that same license in GCC high is $93.33. So there's a price difference, and that's why when you look at enclaves, it's not just the enclave, you know, the assessment scope and everything else. You're also trying to look at the annual cost to actually manage it.
So, Walt, Jeff, do you guys have any questions we can answer for you?
No, I think the struggle that we've been working through is determining what COI data we have, and then who would have to handle it for us to be successful as a company. And this enclave idea where we separate the required folks into the high environment versus the entire company into, I'll just call it low environment 1.0. That's a brilliant idea, Matt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what's nice about it is that if it's all about the assessment scope. Because if you got the right controls in place from day one, you can keep your cost under control. And then as you see the need, you already have developed the policy and procedure as part of your certification process. You now can add users into the other environment, and you basically have managed it. Versus like, you know, doing an assessment of 100 users for GCC high and CMC L2, because now you're opening up the can of worms for the maintenance folks. Everything comes in the building. You're really trying to get it down to how do you do what you're supposed to do, protect the information, and basically do it so you can actually, you know, grow your business.
Yeah, excellent comment, Jeff. And you know, doing the scope will keep a lot more money in your brilliant bank account as well.
Who doesn't mind that?
Exactly. Any other questions there, Jeff, or thoughts?
No, is it does it require two separate 365 tenants because one's high and one's commercial? So are they actually two separate tenants? And then are they joined together in some way or not at all?
They're two separate tenants. They're not related to each other. The same domain is not, you can only have one domain, one side or the other. So they're 100% independent. So they're not even in the same building.
And we usually throw a .us on the GCC domain name to separate them out from the commercial.
Yeah. And it's basically the Azure Gov tenants. They're continental US. They're managed by US citizens, and there's all sorts of different controls on them and everything else associated with it. And keep in mind, Microsoft has a lot of different 365 tenants in Azure Gov at different security levels.
We love questions. Anybody else have any questions they want to throw out, or ideas, or things maybe you're hung up on a little bit and not real clear on? I know this is a lot of information depending upon, you know, how much time you've spent with CMMC material. So if you'd like a copy of today's slide deck, just email me and I'll be happy to shoot that over to you. And I'll put my, it's mclass, MCLASS at KAMIND.com. And I'll put that in the chat window as well. All right, well, you know, going once, going twice. Any more questions? Well, I'm showing about 10:51, so really appreciate everybody joining us today. Look forward to seeing you on our next KAMIND webinar. And if you think of any other questions down the road, just, call us, email us. We'll be happy to respond to those. Anyways, again, we appreciate your time and your participation today. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks and have a good day. Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Nice job.
thanks, everyone.
Nice job, Matt.